Okay, good morning, and thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. Well, I will start by saying that I guess that I'm the wrong person to open a colloquium on diaspora. But then I thought that exactly this, namely the fact that I'm the wrong person, makes me the right person to do so. And that's a strange statement to open a conference. That's a handful. So let me briefly explain that. I think I've been coming to the Banyi, to the bathhouse readings, for about 10 years. Maybe there's lots of times. I mean, it's become part of my life. And Irina knows that each time I've learned so much that I really want to come back. But of course, not all topics that the NLO group are choosing are topics for which I'm a specialist. So our understanding is, Irina's and my understanding is, that whenever the topic is not a topic that I know much about, I take a step back and try to offer a distant reflection about the topic or the concept in question, and this time it's diaspora. So this exactly is what I like to do today in a specifically distant way. I will talk in a specifically distant way about the concept of diaspora, because I have to admit that diaspora for me is one of my least favorite critical concepts. And when I'm saying critical concepts, I'm saying it in the American sense of the word, concepts used in literary criticism. Because I think, and that's in my title, that in American literary criticism at least, this concept of diaspora has a very strange aura. Whenever a culture is described as diasporic, that's the adjective, at least in the American context, this predication produces the expectation or even the obligation to particularly appreciate that culture and its product. So if you say that's a diaspora culture, you are not allowed, to speak practically, to say that is not a beautiful culture, an important culture to be appreciated. Now, the reason for this appreciation, for this very general, unavoidable appreciation of cultures called diasporic, are vague. It's not quite clear why you have to appreciate it. They seem to be ethical, moral, and political rather than aesthetics, but they seem to be protected in the American discussions against any critical objection. So you cannot say anything negative about diasporic cultures. Now, in this sense, I think it may be good for the colloquium, and this is just my opinion, may be good for the colloquium to start with a speaker who is neither a specialist in the topic nor very sympathetic to this concept. Because what I will try to do is to measure out the concept of diaspora, to unfold its semantic and historical complexity, and I think it has a huge complexity, and to map its meanings and implications. So if everything goes well in the next 20 minutes, maybe we can start the colloquium with the first epistemological structure, with a framework for the discussions. And as you know, I'm always giving you a summary, a menu of what I'm doing. I will try to do that in 5 quick steps, and don't worry, it's going to be really a quick step. I will start by describing where I'm coming from, where I first encountered the concept of diaspora, and that is within American literary criticism. In the second part, I will unfold its history, its etymology, and with it the enormous semantic complexity of this concept, of which we are often not aware. In the third part, and that will be a specifically historical part, I will explain where this aura comes from. Why are you obliged to appreciate diasporic cultures? And I think it comes from the 18th century. And in the fourth part, as the concept of diaspora implies when we describe diasporic cultures a perspective of otherness, I will give you a genealogy of how Western cultures, at least, and I include Russian culture, so as opposed to Asian cultures or African cultures, have dealt since the Middle Ages with otherness. And that genealogy will lead me to the present, and to the question, are we still in a situation in the early 21st century where this concept of diaspora makes sense? And my answer will be an ambiguous answer. So first point, diaspora as a critical concept, as a concept of literary criticism, a concept that first emerged in the United States in the context of identity studies in the 1980s, in the 1990s. Now, the concept of diaspora is not used for every minority culture. It is only used for minority cultures under three conditions. It is used in the first place when a minority culture does no longer take place in its place of origin. So a migration has been taking place before you speak of minority culture. You speak of minority cultures when you refer to cultures that have no direct access to political power. Diasporic cultures normally don't have access to political power, and this is, I think, the aspect that Irina was mentioning, you speak of diasporic cultures when you feel that despite their inadequate environment, they have a very strong coherence, they have a very shaped identity. Now, beside these three components that I was mentioning, in a different place, no access to political power, and very strong coherence, beside that, and beside this descriptive function of the concept of diaspora, it has this strange aura, this positive premise that implies the obligation of compassion. You have to have compassion with diasporic cultures, of support, and of aesthetic appreciation. So imagine how much more support Jewish culture would have today if the State of Israel did not exist. But since the State of Israel exists and Jewish culture is dominant in a certain context, it does no longer have this international support as a diasporic culture. So it's much easier for Armenian culture to have this moral support than for Jewish culture since the foundation of the State of Israel. I think that has changed. You get my point. So precisely because there is no access to political power, there is an obligation, a moral obligation within criticism, within the academic world to support it. An example for what I'm talking about is the concept launched by Deleuze and Guattari of littérature mineure that they applied above all to German Jewish culture in a Czechoslovakian context. Yeah, I mean, Kafka's German Jewish culture is une littérature mineure, is diasporic culture, and description of Kafka today, historical descriptions, emphasize this diasporic component to a degree that Kafka would not even have understood. But I mean, Kafka is read out of the perspective of being a diasporic author. It's even kind of questioned whether Kafka can be part of German literature. He wrote in German, but it was not German literature. Now, let me give you one more additional observation that comes from my present situation. I'm actually presently, this time, the first time, I did not come to Banyu from California, from Stanford. I'm on a 3-month fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And it was just last week, sitting in the subway, that I realized that although I'm in Berlin, when I hear people talking around myself in the bus or in the subway or even in the taxi, when the taxi driver is on his telephone, I don't necessarily expect them to speak in German. I expect them to speak in any language. It can be German, it can be above all in Berlin Turkish. You know that Berlin is the third largest city of Turkey. It could be any Iranian language, it can be Hebrew, but it is not necessarily German. So Russian, especially in taxis. Yeah. But you have more Russian taxis in New York, actually, in Manhattan, I guess. But anyway, so if these are diasporic situations, and if at least under metropolitan culture, the diasporic situation has become the general situation of culture today, I'm asking for the first time, and I will come back to this point, whether it still makes sense in the early 21st century to talk about diasporic cultures as something specific. Or should we say that diaspora is our general condition today? And this was my first point. You see, it's a quick step. The 5 points go fast. Now, the second point is about the etymology of the concept and its enormous complexity. And it's an open series. I will highlight some semantic aspects of diaspora, but there are more of it. The word diaspora existed in ancient Greek culture and ancient Greek language long before the fate of the Jewish people, with which we mainly, at least as an ex-German, associated. Diaspora meant dispersion, dissolution, disintegration, but all these meanings implied, and this is very important, a prior moment of destruction. For example, diaspora means in Aristotle the dispersion of the ashes of a corpse, a dead body, that has been burnt before. Or diaspora means the dissolution of an entire object into its atoms. So you see, it's disintegration, dissolution, dispersion, but always with the implication that something has been destroyed. So this is the first connotation, this destruction of something. In the early Greek translations of the Torah, or of the Old Testament, the word appears 12 times, and that is quite a lot, to describe the fate of the Jewish people. And that implies a second semantic component, and the semantic component of ambiguity. Diaspora is used for situations where, after a military defeat, a part of the Jewish people has to migrate into a different culture, mainly into Mesopotamia, and is absolutely physically obliged to adapt to that culture. But diaspora also refers to situations of a more or less voluntary emigration, where Jews are eager, this is the Egyptian case, to adopt to the other culture, and are hesitant to go back to the land of their origin. So this is the second component. There is an ambiguity in diaspora between forceful subjection and obligation on the one hand, and voluntary migration and hesitation to come back in the second hand. Now, thirdly, in the interpretation of those historical anecdotes of the fate of the Jewish people, there are two elements that come back all the time. Diaspora is normally interpreted as a divine punishment. It is a divine punishment of the Jewish people that they have to be in a diasporic situation. And fourthly, diaspora is also a situation that is always threatened by the loss of cultural identity. When you are in a diasporic situation, there is a threat of a loss of cultural identity. Now we know, well, I didn't know till 2 weeks ago till I prepared this lecture, but I found this very interesting, that the first Jewish synagogue ever was built in a diasporic situation. The first synagogue ever was built in a diasporic situation. I find that very interesting because I find this fact is an emblem for the specific closure of diasporic cultures. Yeah? Only when you're in a diasporic situation, you need a house of God that is specific, that is different from mosques or different from churches. Finally, I believe that there is no other culture that has lived and maintained its cultural identity for so long under diasporic conditions as the Jewish culture, for 2.5 million years. But that does not protect a culture, having lived in a diasporic situation for 2.5 millennia, does not protect this culture against the ultimate catastrophe. So the Holocaust occurred after 2.5 millennia of diasporic situation, and that is the final cultural connotation which I want to highlight here, that there is a never-ending precariousness of diasporic situation. In diasporic situation, you and your culture are never safe. So this is the second out of 5 steps. I come to the third step, the third question, and that is the question, where does this strange aura come from? Why do we feel obliged to appreciate diasporic cultures? Why do we feel we are not allowed to ever criticize or not like them? I mean, Kafka in the Czechoslovakian, and then it was Czechoslovakian environment, for example. I think today, no doubt, that has to do with the connotation of the Holocaust, for example. You feel if you criticize diasporic cultures, you also are on the wrong side, morally speaking, somehow. But I believe that there is a more general prehistory that goes back to the 18th century, to the century of Enlightenment, and to the emergence of the role of the intellectual. Intellectuals were called philosophes. French was the general language of the 18th century in the 18th century. During the first half and in the middle of the 18th century, this role, the role of the philosophe, of the intellectual, think of young Voltaire, was constituted above all by daring provocations of authority, by daring provocations of the political system, of monarchy, by daring provocations of the church. But by the middle of the 18th century, especially in France, the intellectuals, the philosophes, had come under certain pressure. The monarchy had reacted, specifically the church had reacted, and they asked with which moral authority do they pronounce these provocations? What is the right of the philosophers to criticize the church? What is the ethical right to do so? So this was the situation, let's say, when Diderot and d'Alembert started the encyclopédie. Do you have a right to criticize everything around you? Who are you to do that? Now, it was in this situation, more specifically, more precisely in 1761, and this is something to do with the next book, which my next book will be a book on Diderot, Voltaire, and Rousseau, that in 1761, in a moment when the philosophes, the intellectuals, were under this pressure, what is your moral legitimacy, when Voltaire began to protect publicly the family of Jean Calas, C-A-L-A-S. Now, Jean Calas was an unimportant person in a way. He was a Protestant from Toulouse, so absolute minority, a Protestant from Toulouse, who had been executed, killed, by the French legal system because he had been accused that he had killed his oldest son because his oldest son had threatened to convert to Catholicism. This was an erroneous accusation. Now, Voltaire waged a campaign, and it may really be the first campaign ever in Western culture waged by an intellectual in order to protect the family of Jean Calas and in order to rehabilitate Jean Calas. And it was by this identification, by this very public identification with the weak and the repressed, that Voltaire gained moral authority. And this is my point. Ever since Voltaire, in order to have moral authority as an intellectual, you are absolutely obliged to support the weak no matter what. I would say even if the position of the weak is not a morally justified position, to identify with the weak, to identify with the repressed, to protect them, gives you an aura of moral authority. And I've been talking about Voltaire all the time. Of course, the one philosophe of the 18th century who absolutely embodies that in his own life is Rousseau. Yeah? You can read the Confessions of Rousseau as a book that make Rousseau completely invulnerable, morally and politically invulnerable, because he gives himself the position of the repressed, of the weak, of the diasporic. He's a citizen of Geneva living under conditions of the French monarchy, and therefore he's invulnerable. So you could say that, paradoxically speaking, ever since the 18th century, for Western intellectuals, the identification with the repressed, the identification with the weak, is a claim of moral authority, is therefore an object of desire. And I think this is what explains this strange moral aura of the concept of diaspora. And this explains the prohibition to ever criticize anybody who is in a position of diaspora. This is why, even if you do not like Kafka, you have to appreciate Kafka's literature as soon as it is presented as a literature of diasporic conditions. And by the way, I like Kafka a lot, so I'm not implying that I don't find him interesting. Now, this brings me to my fourth point. The concept of diaspora implies a concept of otherness. Yeah, when you talk about diasporic culture, it's normally not your own culture. You can do that, but normally when we speak as intellectuals, we speak of other cultures. And this is why I want to briefly ask myself, what is the genealogy, the history of the relationship with cultural otherness in Western culture since the Middle Ages? Now, social and cultural otherness in the Middle Ages was never national otherness or racial otherness or social otherness. You could only see the world, the other world, from inside Christianity, and that means everything that was outside Christianity was pagan. Yeah? The only possibility of cultural otherness in the Middle Ages was to identify something as pagan. And if it was pagan, it was either something to be converted. You had to convert the pagans, and then you would organize a crusade to convert them and to reconquer the Holy Land. And there was no understanding that the Muslims had a right, that this was their land, like today. That would be an impossible discussion. Or you would just leave them alone. But the only possibility of cultural otherness in the Middle Ages was being pagan. Now this dramatically changed with early modernity from the 14th, 15th, 16th century on, and with the new self-reference in European culture. During the Middle Ages, you had always spoken from inside Christianity. Now the new role of self-reference was what we call the subject. And the subject is by definition and understanding an outside observer of the world. I mean, everything is outside for the subject, even your own culture. And that means that from early modernity on, due to this new role, to this new self-reference of the subject, otherness is principally ambiguous. The other can be either very negative or very positive. A good example are the very early records of the conquest and colonization of America, especially South America. You can indeed find it in the chronologically very first text in the board book of Columbus. So the natives of America for Columbus are still pagans, that's the medieval point of view, and therefore people to be converted, but they are, and this is the ambiguity, at the same time of a paradise-like innocence. They are also normative. They also become an object of desire. The Muslims were absolutely not an object of desire in the Middle Ages. They were pagans. Now all of a sudden otherness could either be something to be converted or something to be highly appreciated. I mean, the one Spanish name, so that you know I'm a Hispanist by training, that comes to mind is a Benedictine monk who was very important in the early colonization, and that's de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas was the first to describe American natives. Really, he used the word of paradise. Maybe paradise was not in Mesopotamia. Maybe the new continent that we have discovered was paradise. Now that continued throughout the 17th and 18th century. For example, if you look at Oriental, Middle Eastern cultures in France during that time. This is always an ambiguous image. I mean, the Turks or the Persians are a threat, a military threat, especially the Turks, and at the same time, there's something positive, something normative. Think of Montesquieu's Lettres Persanes, or think, I mean, this is not Middle Eastern, but think of Voltaire's Lettres Anglaises. That's a different culture, and therefore it's a positive culture, a culture that is normative, a culture that is to be imitated. Now, it is important to underline at this point that until the late 18th century, the appreciation and the perception of otherness does not imply any concept of nationality. The concept of nation does not exist. And therefore, and that is a third step in this genealogy, I think a new step a new level in the appreciation of cultural otherness emerges from around 1800 on with the emergence of the concept of the nation and with the nation state. Now, my thesis is that the concept of the nation as an emphatic concept always emerged from situations of resentment. Always emerged from situations of resentment in the Nietzschean sense. The concept of the nation does not emerge in those states, in those societies, like the United Kingdom, as we call it today, Britain, like the United States, like France, that have gone through a successful bourgeois revolution or bourgeois enlightenment. It emerges first in societies that start their reforms, their bourgeois reforms, from a position of defeat, like Germany, like Italy, like Spain, and who, because they start from a position of defeat, go back to a completely imaginary picture of what the nation would have been in the Middle Ages. You could say that the first concept of nation in that sense, think of Novalis, for example, around 1800, is an imaginary concept of what the German quote-unquote nation would have been in the Middle Ages, and this concept then becomes normative during the 19th century. Now, obviously, this concept, this normative concept of the nation, is a concept that implies the obligation of an exclusion or of the repression of diasporic cultures. Yeah? Everybody who lives within this society, within German society, has to be German, has to either become German or has to be eliminated. And it is without any doubt this concept, this resentful concept of the nation state, which poisoned with biological discourses of racism around 1800, facilitated the Holocaust. This is it is the concept of the nation state in this sense, the resentful concept of the nation state, that facilitates the Holocaust as the ultimate, the unbeatable, the insuperable catastrophe of diasporic cultures. Now, mind you, although I'm saying this, I'm not implying that this situation of vulnerability of diasporic cultures necessarily implies the right of more legitimacy. I think, and this is difficult to think because we are so used to think the opposite, it is possible to be in a situation of weakness without moral legitimacy. And the position of weakness is not necessarily, not by any philosophical argument, also a morally legitimized position, although we act as if it were. So if you're in the weaker position, you are normally morally legitimized. I mean, this is how we act as intellectuals. Final reflection, and Irina is all surprised that this, for the first time ever, I will make it more or less within the allotted and assigned time.
I'm incredibly amazed.
Yeah, you're really amazed. Maybe you're disappointed. Maybe I should expand the last point so I don't get invited next year.
Plenty of questions too, so we need to...
Well, good. Okay, so that's what I anticipated. So the final reflection brings me back to this Berlin experience. You know, in the bus, in the subway. So I don't expect German naturally when I'm in Berlin, and this is the question, this is a key question for the colloquium, is the concept of diaspora a concept that offers itself in the early 21st century for cultural analysis? My answer is ambiguous. I'm not saying it's an error to use this concept, but I wanted to sharpen a little bit the discussion. But I want to answer on two levels. First level, the approach that NLO is proposing towards situations of diaspora, and Irina was mentioning that in her introduction, is an anthropological approach. Now, anthropology today, especially cultural anthropology, means reflexive anthropology. And reflexive anthropology means that you are allowed to bring the baggage of your own cultural pre-orientations. I mean, Gadamer would say you are allowed even to bring your own prejudice towards the analysis of other cultures as long as you are aware of that baggage, as long as you are aware of what you project in the other culture. So because it would be impossible not to project anything, so the question is a hermeneutic question. Can you fully realize what you are implying when you use the word? Now, this is the reason why I've been trying to make you aware, to make us aware at the beginning of the colloquium, of the very, very complex implications of the concept of diaspora. And it is in that sense an open question for me whether the baggage that the concept of diaspora implies, the multiplicity of pre-orientations, is not so heavy that the concept doesn't really lend itself to be a good critical, descriptive, analytical concept. I mean, I think as long as we always are aware of it, it's feasible. But it is a concept like the concept of symbol, for example. I mean, I always find this problematic in literary criticism to use the concept of the symbol because there are so many connotations that you always have to say, I mean it in this sense, but not in this, and this other sense. And that's a little bit the case with diaspora. So I use diaspora and I exclude the moral implications. You can do that, but it produces a lot of empty discourse and at the same time necessary discourse. Now, The other level on which I will try to react to this question, is diaspora still a good concept for the early 21st century, has more to do with this Berlin subway situation. I mean, are we living in a culture where it still makes sense to talk of diaspora as something specific, or is diaspora today not the general condition of culture? Now, I think this is different in different contexts, and this is why I will conclude talking about diaspora in three different contexts today, in the legal context, in the social and sociological context, and in the context of intellectual discussions, of intellectual life, of our context. As far as the legal context is concerned today, I find it interesting to observe that most constitutions today, at least those constitutions which one is tempted to call democratic, do normally not imply cultural identity as a precondition for being a citizen. So in order to be a German citizen, for example, it is not required that you can prove that you have any German cultural identity. Minimal knowledge of German language is required. That's the same with American nationality, but that's a practical thing because you cannot participate in public and political life if you do not have minimal linguistic connotations. I mean, the German Constitution, for example, gives some advantages for becoming a citizen if you can claim that you have some cultural authority. So if you apply for German citizenship out of St. Petersburg and you have a German ancestor since the 18th century, it takes less time to become a German, but it is not a necessary requirement. Now that this is the case, that today we do not think that constitutions, meaning the legal system, cares about cultural authority, is proven by the fact that we all protest, and I think for all the right reasons, against the new Hungarian constitution. Because the new Hungarian constitution, scandalously, I would say, in the early 21st century, makes the possession of some Hungarian cultural identity a precondition of being able to become Hungarian. And at the same time, it declares that all Hungarian people of Hungarian origin who are Romanian citizens are Hungarian. Yeah? I mean, we find that very strange, and I think the fact that we find that so strange is A, good thing, and B, proves that we do not think that the diasporic situation is any exception from a legal point of view today in the early 21st century. And as an American citizen, I will proudly say the first constitution ever that did not mention that requirement was, of course, the American Constitution, for the simple reason that there was no original population, or maybe there was one, but was ignored. All the immigrants came from different countries, and English immigrants were not more important or more American citizens than German or Italian or Spanish immigrants. Second out of three closing configurations, from a sociological or social point of view, today we have an ambiguous situation regarding the diasporic situation, regarding cultural otherness. Due to new conditions of mobility, and I would also say due to electronic communication, the concept or the imagination of a dominant national culture today has been largely blurred. I think there is no strong feeling today, or much weaker feeling, of a dominant national culture than 20 years ago, than 50 years ago. I mean, if you take a taxi from Domodedow downtown Moscow, the environment that you see, I mean, at first glance, is much less Russian, much more quote-unquote international than it used to be. I mean, you see 24 and you know it's an ATM machine, for example. You see McDonald's and it's McDonald's, and so forth and so forth. So, I mean, there are diasporic situations wherever. On the other hand, and that makes the ambiguity, it is still possible today, especially in situations of crisis, to activate that resentment that was the basis of the exclusive concept of the nation state. This is still possible. So if you need it as a politician, you can still activate that. And I suppose that the fact that this has been happening in several European nations, especially Eastern European nations, in the last decades must be one of the reasons why this concept is fascinating for you. So it is no longer the dominant situation, but if you need it, you can still activate this exclusionary resentment that is the basis of the concept of the nations. Third consideration, from the point of view of intellectuals, the dominant attitude seems to be also an attitude of ambiguity, but an attitude of ambiguity that is a double bind. So that's a problematic ambiguity. Because we intellectuals want, on the one hand, that diasporic cultures have the right to be preserved. They should maintain their coherence, they should maintain their identity, but at the same time we want that there is no obstacle against their integration into the cultures by which they are surrounded. Yeah? So, we want them to be integrated, and integration, of course, means that the cultural identity will disappear, and at the same time we want them to maintain their diasporic identity. What we would say in colloquial American English, you cannot have the cake and eat it. You cannot have both in a certain way. So this is why I want to finish this presentation and somehow open the colloquium with 3 questions to which my presentation has been leading, I hope. And they're not rhetorical questions. I think they're real questions that, together with other questions, I think we should pursue throughout the colloquium. The first question is a question about the concept of diaspora. I've tried to demonstrate you how complex it is, how many connotations it has. So the first question is whether it can be a good critical concept, an economic critical concept, despite all these connotations. Although you constantly have to say this is not what I mean when I'm saying diaspora. In the second place, we should ask ourselves whether it is really a meta-historical concept, whether it is a concept that we should still apply to the cultural situations of the 21st century, or whether the time where it was a very pertinent cultural concept, and I would think that is above all in Europe, the 19th and the early 20th century, has passed today. And finally, I think we should thematize the question and, if possible, make up our minds about that double bind. If we want the possibility of integration to happen, then, of course, the identity of cultural diasporic situations will be blurred. You cannot have the cake and eat it. And we should also ask ourselves whether really all diasporic cultures are wonderful cultures. You sometimes have the impression that the appreciation goes, the more diasporic, the higher the quality, which I completely disagree with. But I want to leave you with these questions, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Has been taken out of its original context and moved. And what I really appreciated in your paper, Sepp, was an understanding specifically of the way that diaspora doesn't apply well to the things that I'm interested in. So I wanted to actually reframe your questions and say, what are the other words which are available? And I don't really know what the answer is. Because I think, clearly diaspora, as you've explained it so well, is a term which, first of all, has a certain hidden baggage, a longing for a kind of naturalized placement of cultures within specific geographical contexts, which is increasingly, I think, first of all, impractical in our world. Cultures are not placed anymore in terms of geographies. Nor is it necessarily the case, and in my personal case, it's clearly not the case that I'm sympathetic with that idea of the world, that we should have cultures all fixed into specific sort of geographical boxes which are territorially contiguous, and people should be together in some sort of an endogamous way with their cultures and able to reproduce them and so on. It seems to me that actually, if you ask me what my aspiration for the universe would be, it would be like some kind of universal cosmopolitanism or something. Although I haven't thought it out well, because history is long and we'll see where we all get. The question, though, I want to ask is there a better or a different frame of reference which we can use to talk about the operations of cultures which project themselves as being coherent systems of interrelationships across larger and larger global territories, which are not linked to specific contiguous spaces. Because clearly, I'm interested in operations of Russians in lots of different places. But I don't think that the Russians that I'm interested in are actually diasporic in the sense that you've outlined it. It's like Russian communities living in New York and producing very rich traditions of poetry in English and in Russian, I don't think are well described with this terminology. Nevertheless, they're very interesting. So the question that I would pose as a follow-up question to your question really is there a different terminology to describe this kind of cultural being, dispersed across territories, but not necessarily containing within it this particular kind of political baggage, historical baggage, which is linked, as you discussed, to this concept of diaspora?
Well, before I answer your question, I think I have an exceptionally specific answer to your question, a proposal to make. I mean, proposal as an answer, a proposal for NLO. Let me use your question to just mention briefly three things where I'm coming from. I mean, so why do I have this? Phobia is too much, but why, when I thought, this is the colloquium this year, and I really want to come every year, but why does it have to be diaspora? That was my first reaction when I saw the topic. And I think I have three components, and they are maybe paradigmatic for that huge tail of connotations. I mean, in the first place, I was born in Germany in 1948. The entire, etymological association, you cannot really isolate the concept of diaspora from Jewish history. That, at least for me, that is a problem. Then secondly, of course, like yourself, I guess, and I know, I'm sick and tired of political correctness in our American universities. It's overcome, it's kind of dead, but it has this institutional inertia. Yeah? Nobody believes in it anymore, but it is still the rule. So you can still not get tenure. I was about to tell an anecdote, but it's still a risk. And then thirdly, and that's an interesting example, and that's where I was coming from, that sometimes you feel the smaller the better. So you know that there has been this long rivalry in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula between Castilian and Catalan culture. It is absolutely impossible to say today in Spain as a country that publicly you're more interested, you appreciate more Castilian culture than Catalan culture. If you say, Castilian literature is more interesting than Catalan literature, you are out, even in Madrid. You're not allowed to say that. Now that has led to a proliferation. My daughter Sarah went to school in Valencia, and you know that Valencia has trilingual traffic signs. Every traffic sign is in Castilian, in Catalan, and then in Valencian, which is a dialect of Catalan, but they have declared it an own language because it is more diasporic then and gets appreciated. So then the next step is you have neighborhoods being done. So this is some of these orientations where I think it will be very difficult to liberate us from that. Now, my proposal, my answer to your real question would be twofold and brief. I completely share with you, you know endlessly more about it, but the appreciation, the fascination about the phenomena you want to describe. But my first reaction is, can you not just proceed inductively? Study these cases, describe them, and oftentimes in trying to describe something, you produce your own set toolkit of terminology. And I know that you're the person who probably sympathizes with me here, if there is a ready-made set of concepts, quote-unquote theory, quote-unquote philosophy, that I would find specifically useful in that case, it would indeed be Luhmannian system theory. That is clearly focused on closure and opening. Yeah? So, if I go one step further, and that's a step I should not go, I would propose a translation of social systems, Luhmann's key book, into Russian, and precisely working with the basic distinctions. You don't have to become a system theorist, but these basic distinctions, which I think are as if they were made for this question. Because one of the key fascinations of Luhmann is opening closure. How does a culture develop, a social system develop different under situations of coupling pressure and so forth and so forth. So that there seems to be a repertoire of concepts that is very appropriate for the question here.
Any other questions?
Thomas.
Only a brief remark that this question about Russian poetry in contemporary Brooklyn, I think it's not possible to speak about this phenomenon in terms of diaspora, because the condition of diaspora is collective coherence as a part of a nation. The nation in exile is the primary concept we know from Torah, and this phenomenon which I'm very interested in, and I try to follow this phenomenon, but because I think it's absolutely new phenomenon in terms of language, because those people are speaking primarily American English. They are even writing poetry in English, and at the same time they are definitely a part of Russian culture because of their cultural baggage and so on. But it's exactly the post-diaspora phenomenon, I think, because they are in no terms a part of this old definition of diaspora.
I mean, that was, two brief commentaries on that. I think in the first place that was the beginning of the discussion I wanted to provoke a little bit. And I think it's useful, as long as we keep in mind what connotations we have, and we discuss whether we want to use them or not, the concept is okay. But if you don't do it, I think you're constantly, kind of diverted or you digress for reasons you don't control, you don't know. Now, secondly, what you say about I didn't know about that, about Russian poetry in Brooklyn, for example, that is very interesting, and I'm asking myself, and that's a question back that we can discuss in a coffee break or whatever, whether this is specifically for the American situation. Because I, for example, know considerably good, I can only read the English, several bilingual poets of that kind. So I know one whom I really love to read in English, that's Farsi. And he's actually, he's an economist, Stanford graduate, and a multimillionaire. But he's Pakistani, that's his passport, and he produces Farsi and English poetry. Now, the difference, one could ask whether this bilingual poetry or literature production is typical under American conditions, and whether instead of being diasporic under 19th, 20th century conditions, it is precisely this new cosmopolitan situation. My real question is whether this is not specifically American. And why is it specifically American? In the sense that no authority, no institution cares about it. Yeah, and that's an advantage, I think. As opposed to the situation of German-Turkish literature. As soon as anybody with quote-unquote Turkish genes produces a piece of literature, every feuilleton, every cultural sections in the excellent German daily newspapers will write about it. Say it's very, very wonderful. They immediately get national prizes, and immediately everybody says they are absolutely the best. Yeah. And that, in a way, from an aesthetic point of view, is not necessarily good and productive for these cultures. It also produces a strange preservation, in a way. Now, we have the fourth generations of Turks living in Germany, and they are in this very strange, I would say, rather, it's another kind of ambiguity. They have German passports. They still speak German, the fourth generation, with a specific accent that's called Turksprach. And they are, in a way, not allowed to write, quote-unquote, completely German literature. Yeah, and that is a situation that I think is probably not German-typical, but EU-typical. And it comes from this over-appreciation, that does not exist under American conditions.
Последний вопрос. The last question.
Actually, two questions, but I hope we will manage to keep time.
Two I manage.
First question is about the subject which emerged, as you said, somewhere between 15th and 16th century. I would like to know what were the preconditions for this emergence. Because it's crucial, this shift from the Christian subject who could speak and observe only from the inside Christian paradigm, and suddenly we have this new one who could take the outward stance and could be self-reflexive. And the second question concerns the political dimension of the genealogy you so impressively described. I think it's very important that you mentioned the diaspora as a phenomenon, as a worldwide phenomenon, originates from the absence of the Jewish state. So we have this asymmetry from the modern times when not the absence or destruction of the national state, but the poor condition and other motives force people to leave their native land for the fortune, right? So what are the political consequences of this modern or postmodern condition for diaspora?
Okay, that's fabulous questions to close with. I mean, I have two answers to a question about the subject. I mean, one answer is that it is maybe the key question in the histoire de mentalité of the West. I mean, how can we explain the emergence of the subject? I wouldn't talk of a medieval subject. I mean, the medieval self-reference is precisely not a subject, because subject is always Cartesian. It's only spiritual. It's only your consciousness. Whereas the medieval self-reference includes the body part, so to speak. But that's a different question. Now, I think an answer would be so complex that it doesn't make sense to ask the question. You know, there's certain questions, I mean, how come that the bourgeoisie constitute itself that are so large that the answer would fill 50 volumes, and so you better don't try to give an answer. That is one answer, a lazy answer. The more, I mean, a more specific answer would go like this, goes in this direction. You ask yourself, where do we have the first signs for a fully developed concept of the subject in that sense? So you observe everything from outside, even yourself, even your own world, everything from outside. I mean, the early modern subject position is an absolute outside position as opposed to the medieval position. Well, you know, one of the first authors would be Montaigne, and the first author, I think, is Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli is in an Italian city-state, and you would say the Italian city-states are states that are, by 14th, 13th century standards, in an unbelievable way connected, quote-unquote, because the concept is slightly anachronistic, internationally. So these are the first cultural communities in Europe that have an experience, think of Marco Polo, of otherness. Yeah? And once you have an experience of otherness and do not only see the otherness of pagan that you would rather exclude, you do business with them. You have to synchronize time with them. You have to synchronize a currency with them. You have to synchronize contracts with them. Then you are in a different position, and that would be, I would say, it is not by coincidence, it's not randomly, that the chronologically first origin of such a position and the ambiguity, this cultural ambiguity, happens in Italian city-states. So that, my answer would go in this direction. Politically, I would like to pinpoint Israel to talk in one case rather than give a general answer about your question, what political consequences that would have. I mean, my hypothesis, and of course nobody will ever be able to empirically prove or disprove this hypothesis, is and was during the talk, and some of you laughed, but that I understood that laughter as a laughter of sympathy, that the moral authority of Jewish culture today would be higher if the state of Israel did not exist. Yeah? Because then it would be a completely diasporic culture. And then as an intellectual, it would have this aura, and you would automatically identify with them. Who speaks badly about Armenian culture? But many, many people, even Jewish intellectuals, speak very badly about Jewish culture, and that is because there is a state that is dominant. Yeah, and it is very interesting.
The Armenians have also the state, the Armenian state. Armenians are not diaspora people, but they have their own state as well.
That's true, yeah. But I mean, the argument is as long as you have, I mean, talk of Spain, Valencia culture, precisely because even within Spain it doesn't have its own articulation. You can talk with huge sympathy about it. Whereas Catalonia has turned, I mean, ever since Catalonia has a relative independence within Spain, it has become more ambiguous. As long as in Franco Spain it was completely inexistent, you were not allowed to speak Catalan at school or in public, it had this huge aura. Now, it is interesting, and I will end on that as some of you know, Günter Grass on Monday published that, I think, absolutely scandalous poem in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, for which I never write. I'm very proud of it, making a statement that his sympathy is clearly with Iran and that the one nation that jeopardizes world peace is Israel. Now, I think in that case, this has precisely to do, he feels as a former SS member, he feels he can swing that because Jewish culture has an articulation and that country is economically strong and militarily strong. Yeah, so that gives him the moral legitimacy to say they are a jeopardy for world culture. I mean, this is different structurally from the situation of 1926, Mein Kampf, where a Jewish state did not exist.
But I would say it didn't prevent Hitler and his followers
No.
to create the Holocaust.
No, it didn't.
So, not so many intellectuals at that time sympathized with the Jewish people, you know.
No, but what I'm saying is that that Günter Grass can get away with it. See, I was writing something for Sunday Frankfurter Allgemeine saying the interesting thing is that Günter Grass only said publicly and with his own biography, having been a member of the SS, what most German intellectuals think today. Yeah, that is not, I mean, if I'm saying that I'm strongly on the Israeli side in this political conflict with Iran, with German intellectuals, they are very astonished. And for one reason he had to be American to say something so scandalous. Yeah, it's basically unacceptable. Precisely because there is a state that is well organized and militarily and economically strong. If they were militarily and economically weak, it would already be different. Think of Palestine, for example. I mean, I don't even want to push these political things. I mean, I wanted to show you the logic that I think is implied in the conversation. But of course, you're right, it didn't prevent Hitler from the Holocaust. Yeah.
I'm afraid things are much more complicated than we like them to be. But thank you so much. Thank you. That was a wonderful beginning, and I think we'll continue quite a lot of questions that you have raised.
Thank you.
Thank you.